Snapped killer couples told the story of Antoinette Martinez and Cameo Clines, whose toxic romance led to a string of violent crimes.
They were both young Hispanic males. They were found within 3 miles of each other. They were shot both execution style.
What is it that y'all had planned, you and Cameo, at that time?
We look at young women and we automatically assume or think that it was going to be a man that led them astray. And in this case, she's the one that set up both of the young men.
Now serving 2 consecutive life sentences in the Texas Department of Corrections, Cameo Clines, Antoinette's partner in crime, speaks out for the first time, hopeful for a chance at redemption.
I feel like meeting Antoinette just sparked up all the wrong stuff that I had left alone. I think I was under her spell, and she knew that.
She had heard of this, couple, Bonnie and Clyde, and she found her Clyde in Cameo. Eventually, the parole board is going to give that opportunity to Cameo to ask for redemption in the hopes that he might be released. Personally, I don't believe that he should be released.
I'm sorry. Ain't nothing I do or say can ever aid the wounds that I inflicted on him. But I will say that to please forgive me. Forgiveness is freedom. My name's Cameo Clines, and I agree for this interview because I don't agree with people thinking that one mistake should define your whole life. Whether I was being naive at the time or not, I take responsibility for my involvement in it. But I feel like Antoinette took advantage of me. I wouldn't call it love. I felt like I was baited in. She unconsciously baited me in, and that's how I got glued to her. I didn't think she could ever do something bad or wrap my mind around that, but now I can see it's very possible.
June 18th, 2014. At 6:30 a.m., a rancher in Bexar County, Texas, is checking on his livestock after he and his wife had noticed some suspicious activity on their land the night prior.
That morning, the rancher and his wife were awoken by some loud noises. They believed it may have been gunshots. They weren't sure, but the gentleman did go out and he discovered the body of a young man deceased by one of the fence lines of his property. When the sheriff's department made the scene, they did observe a young man with multiple gunshots to his body, one in the torso and one in the neck area. They are also able to determine that this person was bound by some brown packing tape. And they started looking for shell casings and other items of evidence, which they did find some located not far from the body. They discovered some carpet that appeared to come from inside of a trunk. They also discovered other things that would normally be kept in a trunk, such as a car jack.
Based on the evidence, detectives theorized that the victim had been transported to the location in the trunk of a vehicle before trying to flee his captor.
At the time, they were not able to identify the victim. There wasn't any identification found on or near the body. About a day after the body was found, they were able to then work with the medical examiner's office to ID the body using fingerprints. He was a young man by the name of Xavier Cordero.
Police notify Xavier's family of the devastating news.
We give them time, to process the whole situation. And then our next step after that is to try to get as much information from them that's going to assist us in trying to locate who was responsible for the death of their son. We do ask them if there's anything that's missing, either cell phones or vehicles, anything, that their son might have had that we're not aware of.
Mr. Cordero had a black Mitsubishi Lancer, which was a little bit of his pride and joy. He really loved his car. But his vehicle is no longer at his home, and the family doesn't know where it is.
Our first step was to put a bolo out for any law enforcement agency, if they locate that vehicle, to contact me.
Xavier's mom had access to his cell phone plan, and so she was able to give a printout of who he was speaking to.
His mother prints out a phone log for them, and they find that his last phone activity was about 2:20 in the morning on June 18th.
I just called the number. A female answers. I asked her for her name.
At that time, she does identify herself as Antoinette Martinez, a young San Antonio woman. They asked her to come down for an interview, which she did do. When investigators are talking to Antoinette, she does give a little bit of a history of her friendship with Xavier.
She does say that they had a sexual relationship, but she hadn't seen him in about 3 months.
She does indicate that that relationship was fairly short-lived and ended when she started a relationship with a young man, Cameo Clines.
Detectives inform Antoinette that Xavier has been killed.
She does appear to be very shocked and sad that something happened to Xavier. She does talk about Xavier did reach out to her the night prior, according to her, and they were supposed to see each other, but he never showed up to her apartment. She said she has no idea what could have happened to him after they got off of the phone. Investigators asked her if she had anything to do with the offense, and she said no. At this point, she is still a witness that needs to be talked to if there is any additional evidence that kind of comes up, because she is one of the last people to talk to Xavier, but she isn't arrested. She is allowed to leave while they still continue to conduct their investigation.
At the time, Antoinette called, and she told me the police had contacted her. She was telling me that they're questioning her. I started feeling scared and worried because I was driving Xavier's car. And she told me to ditch the car, so I go ditch the car, and she tells me where to ditch it at. And after that, she comes and picks me up in a family member's car, and we went to her apartment.
At this point, Xavier's vehicle had been missing for a few days, and that alert had been made into the system, and a police officer doing a standard patrol did come upon a vehicle that was abandoned, and when he ran the plate, it did come back to Xavier Cordero as being the owner of the vehicle.
We started processing the vehicle, doing fingerprints and taking photos, processing it to see if we get any possible detection of any blood. In this case, we did. Towards the trunk area of the vehicle, we did get some reaction for blood that was recovered and eventually sent to the medical examiner's office for testing.
They were also able to determine that the trunk liner of the vehicle was no longer in it. When you think about the original scene and there being a trunk liner found, you're able to then kind of look back and connect that to the vehicle.
10 days pass without any other leads. Then, on June 30th, investigators get word of another gruesome discovery.
While police are still investigating the murder of Xavier Cordero, another body is found out in a cornfield in South Bexar County. This person is shot in the head with a small caliber handgun.
When I arrived to the scene, I noticed that he was moderately decomposed. There was no identifying kind of features to his face or anything like that. At the same time I'm at the crime scene, I'm getting information from SAPD that they had been working a missing person case by the name of Stephen Rendon. So as they're giving me description of what he was last seen alive in, I'm actually looking at his body at the crime scene, and it's matching up to what he was last seen wearing. At that point, we knew we had a tentative identification on Stephen Rendon.
They are also able to determine that this person was bound by some brown packing tape, which was also something discovered at the Xavier Cordero body dump site.
Investigators realize it's not the only similarity between the two murders.
They were both young Hispanic males. They were found within 3 miles of each other, dumped in a rural, kind of a remote area in Bexar County.
Ballistics evidence later indicated that the bullets that were found both in Xavier's body and in Stephen's body were from the .25 caliber firearm, which is not a common gun.
Everything's similar, and we're over here like, oh my God, you know, we might have some kind of serial killer here.
Were you worried at all? Police were onto you?
You always have the fear of getting caught, but at that time, I was more involved of how I felt towards Antoinette and not felt of what I was involved with.
How did Antoinette seem? Did she seem worried?
She just stayed more close to me for the sake of security, or just the sake of if I get caught, we get caught.
Coming up, as police race to find a connection between the two victims, the clues lead them to uncover a toxic romance.
She was wild in a good way, but I was naive at that time.
The relationship that they had together was a perfect storm.
In June 2014, detectives in rural Bexar County, Texas, are investigating 2 brutal homicides that appear to be connected.
We're talking about bodies that are found in very close proximity time-wise. They are both found in a remote area. We're looking at 2 young men who have been shot.
Authorities discover that 19-year-old Stephen Rendon had been reported missing by his mother 4 days earlier.
Now that we have a potential ID of Stephen Rendon, police do go out and speak with his mother.
2 gentlemen from the Bexar County Sheriff came in. I had thought maybe they were going to be there to kind of talk to me, you know, ask me more questions or anything like that. And he kind of just said they had found a body out in the field, and everything kind of just went blank.
Detectives learned that Stephen had recently graduated high school and was living at home in order to save money for a place of his own.
He was a very easygoing person, very loving. You know, he had a very big heart. I would always tell Stephen, and Stephen knew that. I said, I don't know what I did in my life to deserve someone like you. I said, God gave me a beautiful gift.
Stephen was a giant goofball. He always had a smile on his face. We were in band together. We both were playing percussion. He was definitely talented. He just liked making music. He was a comedian, and he was just an all-around good guy.
After high school, Stephen attended a vocational institute to pursue mechanics. But just 1 year into his training, he suddenly vanished.
When he went missing, and that's when the alarm bell started going off, because it's not in his character just to disappear like that.
Investigators need to figure out what happened on the last time his mom saw him. At this point, she is able to let them know that the evening that he left, he said he was going to go meet up with some friends.
About 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, I remember hearing his phone ring, like when someone's sending you a text message. And maybe about a couple of minutes later, that's when he went to my door and he goes, Mom, he goes, can I go to my friend's house? He forgot his backpack. And I was like, no. I said, it's too late already. I said, can you just wait until the morning? And he kind of just gave me the look like, come on, Mom, can I just go? And I was like, look, just go. do what just drop off the backpack and come back home. I go, because it's late. And he goes, okay. He goes, I'll be back, and he left. Later on, I ended up getting a text from him. And it said, Mom, I'm going to be out a little later than I thought. He was, I'm going to turn off my phone. I love you. The next morning when I woke up, I looked out the window because I, remembered I didn't hear him come home. So when I woke up, I looked out the window and I noticed that his car still wasn't home. So I started calling him, the phone would just ring, don't answer.
When investigators ask Kathy for a description of Stephen's car, they're surprised by her response.
He was driving an orange Mitsubishi Lancer.
Both of our victims actually drove the same type of vehicle. In Stephen's case, he drove a orange Mitsubishi Lancer, and we have Xavier Cordero driving a black one.
After speaking with Stephen's mother, Bexar County investigators put out a bolo for his missing vehicle. That same day, they received pivotal news about an armed robbery from San Antonio police.
There was an aggravated robbery case that happened within the city limits. Our store clerk was shot in the face.
The clerk, thankfully, is just grazed by the bullet, but the bullet and the shell casing are recovered there.
It was a .25 caliber firearm, which is the same type of firearm used in both of the murders.
A witness at the store had followed the assailant across the street and directed police to his location at an apartment.
Police SWAT showed up and eventually set up an area around the apartment.
After the store got robbed, I was in Antoinette's apartment.
What led you then to go rob the convenience store?
Antoinette didn't have no more money. I said, well, what do you want to do? And came up with that idea. I was looking out the blinds. Next thing I know, I see a couple of cop cars go to the back. And the chief of police had told me, you gotta come out or we're gonna go in there and get you. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna come out. Right before I come out, actually, Antoinette's behind the door. And right before I step out the door, she says, Cameo, I love you. And I look at her and I just walk out. That was the first time she said that. I felt like it was insurance though, because we were about to get locked up.
In June of 2014, San Antonio police have taken Cameo Clines into custody as the suspect in an aggravated robbery of a convenience store. Cameo's girlfriend, Antoinette Martinez, is also taken into custody for questioning.
The aggravated robbery happened within city limits, so at that point, it was the San Antonio Police Department robbery unit that is starting that investigation. They had obtained a search warrant, and when they are going through Antoinette's apartment, they start finding things that are connected to these other two homicides.
They found driver's license in the toilet bowl tank. One was Xavier Cordero and the other one was Stephen Rendon.
And there was an orange Mitsubishi Lancer parked right in front of the apartment complex.
Stephen's car was right there, at that apartment.
When Bexar County investigators arrive, they recover a .25 caliber handgun, the same type of weapon used in the convenience store robbery and in the murders.
We also found some brown packaging tape. I knew immediately that that was a close resemblance of the packaging tape that I saw at the crime scene of Stephen Rendon and also Xavier Cordero.
Authorities immediately book Cameo Clines and Antoinette Martinez on suspicion of murder. Cameo is taken to the Bexar County Jail, where he is also arraigned on robbery charges, while Antoinette is transferred to the sheriff's office for questioning.
Antoinette starts off just sort of talking. You get this girl that you think she's going to be a sweet, innocent girl, perhaps just a witness who got involved with a young man who made some bad choices, and she kind of went along for the ride.
She was my role model. Growing up, she was super cool. She was easygoing, but I also felt bad for Antoinette because she did go through some hardships. Her mom passed away. I mean, it was traumatic. I know her dad went through some stuff.
At the age of 12, Antoinette went to live with an aunt. But despite a difficult childhood, she appeared to thrive in her teens.
She was really smart, and I know she did have good grades.
Antoinette was a young woman who had a lot of promise in her life. She had finished high school, had moved out of her home, so she was on her own.
Antoinette supported herself by getting a job at a fast food restaurant, which is where she met Cameo Clines in the spring of 2014. 20-year-old Cameo Clines was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas.
I grew up in a household of one older sister, two older brothers. My household had split apart when I was around 13. My mom and father had a divorce. Everybody went their own separate ways. And I got stuck out on the streets. The house became more of an in and out stop for me. I didn't feel loved. Ain't nobody go searching for me. Ain't nobody was worried about where Cameo was. I fell into drugs and whatnot. And I was in juvenile detention centers for quite a few years. I looked for love in the wrong places, you know. And I always gravitated to women that like to party. But there was a point in my life I had got me a good woman to be with and really wanted to start a family.
At 20 years old, Cameo got a job at a fast food restaurant where he met 19-year-old Antoinette Martinez.
She was wild in a good way. She was very blunt. She'll speak what's on her mind. And I see that same quality in me. We were similar that way. I didn't do heavy drugs, but I did smoke marijuana, and that's one thing I seen that she did on break and before she leaves and whatnot. And I think that's what got us to associate more. And as time went by, you know, I started having feelings for her.
They then entered into more of an intimate relationship.
It sounds like those two were almost like flames that connected each other, where they were able to really see the good in each other when others may have told them that there was no good. There was some form of connection through the lens of trauma.
I feel like meeting Antoinette just sparked up all the wrong stuff that I had left alone, you know, and I didn't even know that it was being awakened.
When investigators confront Antoinette about the murder of her former fling, Xavier Cordero, she continues to claim ignorance.
What do you know about what happened to Xavier?
He never showed up to my apartment.
When investigators present Antoinette with the mounting physical evidence found at her apartment, she begins to break.
What is it that y'all had planned, you and Cameo, at that time?
I was robbing. This is all for rent money.
Rent money?
She had told me she had lost her rent money. She didn't know who took it, and we're searching for it, and she never found it. It was possible she was going to lose her apartment, and that's where she needed money.
Cameo and Antoinette developed a plan to lure people over to their apartment and rob them at gunpoint.
I thought we were just going to drop him off somewhere and just have him walk back home or something.
She's trying to put the responsibility on Cameo. She wanted us to believe that she didn't ever know that anybody was going to be killed.
She wanted herself to sound like she was less responsible in her involvement in it. It was a mutual agreement, but it was not my plan.
In Bexar County, Texas, investigators are questioning Antoinette Martinez about the murder of her former lover, Xavier Cordero. She claims that she and her new boyfriend, Cameo Clines, came up with a plan to get some easy cash.
The first person that gets lured over is Xavier Cordero. Antoinette does comment that she knew that he generally had cash on him. And of course, that's something that they're looking for. She also knew that he had a car, which is the other thing that they were looking for. So once she gets him over to the apartment, we have Cameo who's hiding, and she is trying to get Xavier comfortable.
Told him that we were gonna have sex, so he was getting undressed. Cameo came out with the gun. Get on the ground, didn't get on the ground, I started tasing him, he still didn't move, hit him with the gun in his nose, that's when he was bleeding. He got blood on my carpet, that's when I got mad. I was like, what the hell, you got blood on my carpet, now it's personal between me and you.
She kind of makes all of these admissions. All at the same time, she doesn't appear to be remorseful.
They tied him up, they walked him to his vehicle, which was parked outside. They had him get in the trunk of that car, and they drove him up to a rural field.
Antoinette claims she stayed in the car while Cameo dragged Xavier out of the trunk. She says the plan had only been to rob Xavier, so she expected Cameo to let him go after taking his wallet. But she was surprised by what she heard next.
I heard a gunshot, and then I think he was dead. He was not dead at all. I think he was still breathing, and he went back to go make sure. Shot him again.
The wallet itself, did you get any money from the wallet? The wallet did he have money, so how much money did he have?
I know it's more than 125 and less than 250.
So you're driving back, what happened? What y'all talking about?
Bonnie and Clyde.
Huh?
It's like a Bonnie and Clyde.
It's a Bonnie and Clyde.
Antoinette admits that she and Cameo continued driving Xavier's car for the next 24 hours, until authorities brought her in for questioning the first time.
I think the fact that once Antoinette had talked to police and she was allowed to leave, she didn't get that feeling that she was going to be a suspect, which then I think also kind of gave her that feeling of power that she was going to be able to get away with this. And while that investigation was going on, Antoinette and Cameo were continuing to plan additional crimes.
June 25th, the same type of event took place. This time it involved a stranger, and that stranger was Stephen Rendon.
Made a fake account on the website called Meet Me.
Meet Me? Okay, he calls you.
Yeah, and then he said, can I come over? La la la. Now he said, found the victim.
You told Cameo? You told Cameo you found the victim?
Yeah, I needed a car. I needed money.
Her whole plan was to rob him. Of course, Stephen Rendon doesn't know that. He's coming over for a possible sexual encounter with Antoinette Martinez. She tells me that as soon as he walks into the door, she tells him that, hey, this is a kind of a kinky thing. Let me tie you up with this tape. He agrees with it, he goes along with it, and Antoinette Martinez then goes and uses that brown packaging tape and tapes his arms, his hands, and his legs. That's when Cameo comes out, and then he starts holding the gun to Stephen Rendon's head. They were able to walk Stephen Rendon down the stairs and actually get him into the car and drive him out into the area where he was shot and killed. As soon as Stephen Rendon walks into the field, that's when Cameo Clines pulls the trigger.
That guy only had $5 in his pocket.
Mr. Rendon, when he was robbed, didn't have a lot of cash on him. So Cameo decided to commit a separate aggravated robbery.
Down the hall, investigators bring Cameo Clines into another interrogation room.
Mr. Cline was denying everything. He's basically saying that he wasn't involved in anything in regards to a homicide.
We talked to Antoinette Martinez, and she agreed to try to convince Cameo Clines to confess. She wants to be alone with him, so we can step out for a minute.
Right, I'll just drag you under the bus.
You throwing me under the bus? Nah, it's not cool. I don't know how you gonna throw me under the bus, to be honest with you. Throw me under the bus. Go for it. Try it. Her saying that, it really opened my eyes. Antoinette was not the person I thought she was.
We stopped that interview. I escorted Antoinette Martinez out. As I'm coming back into the room, thinking that I was going to interview Cameo again about, what was going on, I noticed that he was crying on the floor.
At this time, when I was in that interview room, the weight of what happened was fully on me. I was thinking about everything that had just happened the weeks before, a month before, or whatnot, and I couldn't bear it anymore, I felt a lot of remorse, and it's just like everything was playing in my mind. When you go through situations and people ask you questions, about it, you gotta tell them the truth.
On June 30th, 2014, investigators are questioning Cameo Clines about his role in the murders of Xavier Cordero and Stephen Rendon, after Cameo's girlfriend Antoinette Martinez claimed he shot and killed both men.
I only knew Antoinette a couple of months before this happened. I was naive at that time, and I went along with things because I just wanted to satisfy her.
For what reason did y'all do this to Xavier?
It's not me, he persuaded.
Mm-hmm. So she persuaded you to do this?
Yes, sir. She didn't like how he treated her. I didn't know Xavier, Antoinette did. She had opened up to me and said that they had a relationship and that they used to love each other and that he broke her heart and this and that.
So who's the one that shoots him?
Either. Both our hands are on the trigger.
Both of y'all shoot him?
Mm-hmm. I felt like that after what happened to Xavier, that she felt emboldened since she didn't get caught.
Tell me why, Stephen.
I'm trying to make money.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Easy victim. She wanted money for rent. I was just really satisfying her needs, number one, to keep that sense of her wanting my presence.
And that's kind of a theme that just sort of recurs through all of this. It's Antoinette needs money, Antoinette needs a car. And so you have Cameo, who is trying to help her. They could have done that by getting second jobs, but that's not the route that they took. They decided to go for easy money.
I believe that they were on like this ride of trying to get money and driving with no brakes on.
I think that she had heard of this, couple, Bonnie and Clyde. She knew what they were about, and she aspired to be them. They wanted that lifestyle. They wanted the money, and she found her Clyde in Cameo.
Bonnie and Clyde went on a roll of murders, I believe, and I would never say that about us because I would never want to be remembered as that, because that wasn't me.
I believe that the relationship that they had together was a perfect storm meaning that he was psychologically immature, infatuated with her, and that she could manipulate him.
Following his confession, Bexar County authorities charge both Cameo Clines and Antoinette Martinez with 2 counts of capital murder.
It was hard. It was hard for the judge to say that you're charged with capital murder. Yes, it was very heavy.
Authorities continue to build their case against the couple.
It was determined that that same .25 caliber firearm used in the robbery was also used to kill both Xavier Cordero and Stephen Rendon.
With a mountain of evidence against the couple, attorneys for Cameo Clines approached the prosecution about a plea bargain. And on January 12, 2016, Cameo pleads guilty to 2 counts of murder.
Mr. Clines pled to 2 concurrent life sentences for murder, and then stacked on top of that was the 20 years for the aggravated assault against the storekeeper.
I chose to take a plea deal because I wanted everything to be over with already, and, you know, I was not... How could you fight the truth? I felt just... I felt so guilty and bad about everything that I knew I deserved a prison sentence. I knew I deserved to be away from my involvement.
Antoinette, however, decides to take her case to trial. In 2017, more than a year after Cameo pled guilty to murder, Antoinette pleads not guilty. On September 12th, her case goes to trial.
She argued that this was duress and coercion from Cameo. Cameo came down and testified for her. And in that testimony, he basically said that he was the mastermind, that he was the reason. When you really kind of look at why these offenses happen, you see that it's not really Cameo as the reason, it's Antoinette. But as a prosecutor and a trial attorney, you realize that sometimes you can have the world's best case and you lose.
In September 2017, Cameo Clines testifies on behalf of Antoinette Martinez, claiming that he was the mastermind behind the murders of Xavier Cordero and Stephen Rendon. But prosecutors make the opposite argument.
A lot of times we look at young women and we automatically assume or think that it was going to be a man that led them astray. And in this case, Antoinette was the one that set up both of the young men. She's the one that got them to come to her apartment.
In the end, the jury sides with the prosecution.
Antoinette was found guilty of capital murder.
The only time that we saw Antoinette Martinez show any emotion is after she was found guilty. And there were definitely tears for herself. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. So unless laws change in the future, she will die in prison.
Now, 9 years into his own prison sentence, Cameo Clines says that Antoinette manipulated him to take the fall.
I was still naive and I was still trying to protect her.
When there are couples, a male will oftentimes try to do the noble, although it's a displaced nobility, to take the rap for the female that they feel that they have to protect.
I think I was under her spell, and she knew that. If I could speak to Antoinette, I would say, with all grace, I forgive you, because I want to be forgiven.
In my communication with Antoinette, it was a lot of not wanting to look at the crime own the crime, which I found it hard to process myself because you've been in these number of years already. So how do you not take ownership of that? But Cameo has expressed a very deep remorse. He's tried every day to work toward becoming a better person.
I'm sorry, and ain't nothing I do or say can ever aid the wounds that I inflicted on him and my involvement. But I will say that to please forgive me. Forgiveness is freedom. I'd always be ashamed of what I was involved with, always, until my last breath. But one thing I keep in the forefront of my mind is just to be a good person and a better person than I was back then.
Our system is set up in a way that there are certain people that can ask for forgiveness and seek some sort of redemption. And eventually the parole board is going to give that opportunity to Cameo to ask for redemption in the hopes that he might be released. Personally, I wouldn't say that he's remorseful, except for maybe feeling sorry for himself. So I don't believe that he should be released. And I really hope that the families attend parole hearings and let them know how they are still affected every day by what he and Antoinette did.
I think that's a waste of resources to keep them alive. You know what's right and you know what is wrong.
They've done bad things, but they are not bad people. That's just how I feel. Cameo was a broken ship, but I believe in rebuilding broken ships so they can sail again.
I have a hope of being outside these walls one day and helping the youth not go down the same path that I went down when I was younger.
At 2:14 a.m., the phone rang in a house that had learned to fear the sound of ringing, not because of what it might say, but because of what it might finally confirm. 40 years earlier, another call had shattered the same walls, the same hallway, the same silence. Back then, the voice on the other end spoke in fragments. Accident, investigation, unknown. This time, there were no fragments. This time, the words landed whole, identified, confirmed, resolved. And just like that, a truth that had been circling in Ohio winter since 1981 stepped out of the dark and into the light. The night everything began was ordinary in the way tragedies often are. Cold but not brutal. Quiet but not empty. Ohio in late winter carries particular stillness, a kind that makes sound travel farther than it should. A car door closing echoes longer. Footsteps linger. That night, the streets were thinly populated, porch lights glowing like watchful eyes, neighbors settling into routines they believed would repeat the next day. One of them wouldn't. The victim left home with no sense of urgency, no argument, no dramatic exit, just a jacket pulled tighter against the cold, a destination close enough not to worry anyone. That detail would haunt investigators later. The simplicity of it. No signs of fear. No indication of danger. The timeline at first looked clean. Too clean. Because when someone vanishes without resistance, without witnesses, without noise, it means one of two things. Either they trusted the person they encountered, or they never saw them coming. By morning, the absence was impossible to ignore. The house felt wrong. The air heavier. Shoes still by the door. Coffee untouched. The family began calling hospitals, friends, co-workers. Each call tightened the circle of uncertainty. By noon, the police were notified. By evening, the word missing slipped into conversations like a curse no one wanted to acknowledge. And by nightfall, Ohio newsrooms were already drafting headlines that would echo for decades. The search began with urgency, but little direction. Officers walked the usual paths, checked the obvious places. Snow complicated everything, preserving some evidence while erasing other traces entirely. Footprints blurred. Tire marks disappeared. What should have been clues became questions. Dogs were brought in, then called off. Helicopters scanned fields that looked endless in the winter light. Each hour without results hardened the fear into something colder, more permanent. When the body was discovered days later, it wasn't far. That fact alone sent a shock through the community. Close enough that someone could have passed it without noticing. Close enough that the answer had been hiding in plain sight. The scene was quiet. Too quiet. No signs of struggle nearby. No weapon de caber. Just a body, positioned in a way that suggested intention. That detail split opinions immediately. Accident or homicide. Misadventure or something darker. The autopsy raised more questions than it answered. Cause of death was listed with qualifiers. Possible blunt force trauma. Possible exposure. Possible involvement of another party. In 1981, forensic science carried more uncertainty than confidence. The report read like a negotiation with doubt. Investigators circled suspects loosely. A former partner, a co-worker, a stranger. Everyone fit. No one stood out. The family waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Each update sounded the same. Still investigating. No new leads. Following several angles. The words lost meaning through repetition. What remained was the ache of not knowing, the kind that settles into daily life, shaping it around absence. Chairs stayed empty. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Holidays arrived with an extra place, setting that no one had the heart to remove. As the year ended, attention shifted. New cases demanded resources. Files were stacked. Leads cooled. The case slipped into a quieter category, one that did make headlines but never quite went away. Cold case. The phrase sounded clinical, almost polite. It did not reflect the reality it represented. A story paused, not finished. A wound closed without healing. The 1980s moved on. Hairstyles changed. Technology advanced. The town grew, then shrank. The family aged in parallel with the investigation, measuring time not by calendars but by anniversaries of loss. Every few years, a detective would call, ask the same questions, offer the same apologies. We're still looking. We haven't forgotten. And each time, the hope returned just long enough to be heard again. Evidence sat in storage, boxed and labeled with the careful handwriting of someone who believed it would matter soon. Fibers, clothing, photographs. A few items whose relevance was unclear even then. They waited through Reagan, through the end of the Cold War, through the rise of the internet. They waited while officers retired, while departments reorganized, while priorities shifted. In the late 1990s, the case was briefly reopened. A new detective, fresh eyes, a promise of progress. Old witnesses were re-interviewed, their memories softened by time, sharpened by regret. One recalled a car they hadn't mentioned before. Another changed the timeline slightly, enough to stir movement, not enough to hold it. The momentum faded again. The boxes returned to the shelf. For the family, the decades did not dull the loss. They simply learned to carry it differently. Children grew up knowing a story defined by absence. Grandchildren learned names attached to photos that never aged. The truth became something abstract, something almost mythic. They wondered if it even existed anymore, or if time had erased it completely. Then, quietly, something shifted. It didn't come with a press conference or a task force announcement. It began with a routine audit, a review of old evidence prompted by new technology, and an investigator with a habit of asking uncomfortable questions. Why was this never tested? Why was this dismissed? Why did the report stop here? One item stood out. Not dramatic, not obvious, just something that had been cataloged, then ignored. A trace overlooked because it didn't fit the narrative at the time. In 1981, it had been useless. In the present, it was an opportunity. The test took weeks, then months. The lab moved carefully, aware of the stakes. When the results came back, they didn't shout. They whispered. A partial match, a possibility. Enough to reopen the file fully, this time with purpose. Investigators followed the trail back through time, reconstructing movements, re-examining alibis that had once been accepted without question. One name surfaced repeatedly, a name that had been mentioned early, then discarded, a person who had lived close, who had known the victim, who had offered help at just the right moment. The family wasn't told right away. Authorities knew better. Hope, they had learned, was dangerous when handled carelessly. But as the pieces began to align, as doubt narrowed into focus, the call became inevitable. 40 years after Night Ohio went quiet, the truth began to take shape, not as a theory, not as speculation, but as something solid enough to hold. And for the first time since 1981, the question was no longer what happened. It was how long the truth had been waiting for someone to listen. The match was not enough to close a case, but it was enough to wake it up, enough to pull the file from the shelf where dust had settled like a second seal of silence, enough to make seasoned detectives feel that familiar tightening in the chest that only comes when a story refuses to stay buried. The evidence did not scream certainty. It suggested direction. And direction was something this investigation had lacked for 4 decades, a compass needle twitching for the first time since the winter of 1981 froze answers in place. They began by reconstructing the final 48 hours, not as a timeline on paper, but as a lived sequence, stepping into the victim's routine, walking the same streets, standing in the same doorways, listening to the same quiet Ohio wind. Memory, they knew, was unreliable, but patterns were not. People moved in loops. Habits left shadows. Somewhere inside those shadows was a deviation, a moment that had been overlooked because it seemed too ordinary to matter. The detectives noticed something that earlier teams had dismissed as coincidence. A brief interaction reported by a neighbor, logged in a single sentence, never expanded upon. A conversation outside a building. A familiar face. No raised voices. No urgency. In 1981, it read like nothing. In the present, it read like trust. And trust, in cases like this, was often the most dangerous element. They tracked down the neighbor, now older, slower, unsure why anyone would still care. At first, the memory came in fragments, colors without edges. Then a name surfaced. Hesitantly, apologetically. The neighbor had always assumed the police already knew. That assumption, investigators realized, had been the case's quiet killer. Everyone thought someone else had the answer. The name matched the partial result. Not conclusively, but closely enough to demand attention. A background check revealed a life that had unfolded in parallel with the investigation. Ordinary on the surface, marked by moves, jobs, relationships that never quite lasted. No criminal record that raised alarms. No obvious motive. Just proximity, opportunity, and a series of small inconsistencies that had been invisible without the benefit of hindsight. They pulled old interview tapes, listened to the voice recorded on analog equipment, the faint hiss of magnetic tape, carrying words spoken by someone who believed time would protect them. The statements were careful, rehearsed, too careful, details offered where none were requested, gaps where emotion should have been. The detectives exchanged looks. They had seen this before. Not guilt, exactly. Control. The investigation widened quietly. No press. No announcements. Subtle requests to other agencies. Records from storage facilities. Employment logs. Anything that could place the suspect in a specific location during the critical window. In 1981, such records had been sparse. In the modern era, even fragments could be cross-referenced, layered, tested against each other like overlapping transparencies. A breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Not a database, not a confession, but a forgotten box in the municipal archive, mislabeled, untouched for decades. Inside were photographs taken at the original scene, angles not used in reports, details captured incidentally. One image showed something small but unmistakable, an object out of place, something that had never belonged there. That object connected directly to the suspect, not uniquely, not exclusively, but convincingly enough to tighten the circle. Investigators returned to the area where the body had been found, comparing the photograph to the present landscape, noting what had changed and what hadn't. The object was gone, but its absence told a story of its own. Someone had removed it. Someone had known it mattered. The family was informed then, cautiously, not with promises, but with honesty. The case was active again. There was a person of interest. New evidence was being evaluated. The reaction was not relief. Not yet. It was fear. Fear of hope. Fear that the truth, once again, would retreat just as it seemed within reach. Interviews resumed. Old acquaintances were contacted, their recollections reshaped by time and perspective. One person remembered a strange comment made shortly after the death, something that had seemed inappropriate even then. Another recalled a sudden change in behavior, a relocation that felt rushed. Individually, these memories were fragile. Together, they formed a pattern of flight, not escape but repositioning, a subtle retreat from a moment that refused to be forgotten. The suspect was approached carefully, not accused, not confronted, just asked to clarify details. The conversation was polite, almost friendly. The suspect agreed readily, confident, perhaps, that 40 years had built an impenetrable wall. But confidence, investigators knew, often cracked under the weight of precision. When questions became specific, when dates and times narrowed, when small contradictions were gently highlighted, the tone shifted. There was no confession. Not then. Instead, there was agitation, defensiveness, a subtle rewriting of earlier statements. The suspect corrected themselves repeatedly, each correction moving further from the original account. It was enough. The investigation had crossed a threshold. What had once been theoretical was now actionable. Forensic testing continued. Advances that had been unimaginable in 1981 were now routine. Materials once considered too degraded were re-examined. The partial match strengthened. Statistical probabilities tightened. The science did not speak in absolutes, but spoke clearly enough to support what the investigation was already revealing. The moment came quietly. A meeting in a conference room. A file laid open. A decision made not by emotion, but by accumulation. The evidence, taken together, told a story that no longer required imagination. It described a meeting that was meant to be brief, a conversation that turned, an act that was never planned but never prevented. Panic, decisions made in seconds that echo for decades. When the warrant was issued, it did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy. Officers who had not been born when the crime occurred stood alongside veterans who remembered the original headlines. The arrest was calm. No resistance. No drama. Just the closing of a circle that had taken 40 years to complete. The family received the call they had both anticipated and dreaded. The words were careful. The suspect had been identified. Charges were being filed. The truth, long buried, was finally emerging. There were tears, but not the kind people expect. They were quiet, restrained, shaped by years of practice endurance. Justice, they understood, did not erase loss. It only named it. As the news broke, the community reacted with shock that felt delayed, as if the impact had been traveling through time and had only now arrived. People remembered where they had been in 1981, remembered rumors, remembered assumptions. The case was no longer a mystery whispered about. It was a reality, documented, confronted. But even as the legal process moved forward, even as certainty replaced speculation, the case refused to offer closure in the way stories promised. Answers brought new questions. Why now? Why not sooner? How many moments like this have been missed? Not just here, but everywhere. The truth had waited patiently, embedded in overlooked details, in evidence that outlived memory. It had waited for technology to catch up, for curiosity to return, for someone to believe that even after 4 decades, it was worth asking again. As Ohio absorbed the weight of what had been revealed, one thing became clear. The past does not fade. It waits. By the time the courtroom doors opened, the story had already begun to fracture, splintering into versions that lived inside different minds, each shaped by expectation, guilt, memory, and fear. The suspect sat still, hands folded, eyes forward, the posture of someone who had rehearsed this moment without ever believing it would arrive. 40 years earlier, there had been no courtroom, no cameras, no urgency. Just a night that ended badly and a morning that pretended nothing had happened. Prosecutors spoke first, not with fire but with restraint, laying out a sequence that felt deceptively simple. A meeting, a disagreement, a moment of violence, a decision to stay silent. They did not dramatize. They let the years do that for them. Every sentence carried the weight of time lost, of birthdays missed, of grief delayed and stretched thin. The jury listened, aware that they were not just judging an act, but the long shadow it had cast. The defense countered with doubt. Memory fades. Evidence degrades. People misremember. They emphasize the decades between the crime and the charge, suggesting that time itself was a true culprit, distorting facts, inflating coincidence into accusation. It was a familiar strategy, one that had worked countless times before, relying on the assumption that the past is too unstable to hold anyone accountable. But this case was no longer built on memory alone. It was built on convergence. Independent elements aligning from different eras, each weak on its own, but together forming a structure that could bear weight. The partial match, the forgotten photograph, the neighbor's recollection, the inconsistencies in the suspect's own words. None of it shouted. All of it agreed. Witnesses took the stand. Some spoke haltingly, others with unexpected clarity. A former co-worker described a sudden resignation, a move that made no sense at the time. A friend recalled a night of heavy drinking and an unguarded comment that had lingered uncomfortably for years. These were not accusations born of malice. They were memories that had finally found a place to land. The forensic experts followed. They explained patiently how science had changed, how techniques refined themselves not to rewrite the past, but to listen to it more closely. They spoke of probability, of margins of error, of how certainty is constructed piece by piece. The jury leaned forward. This was not television science. This was slow, methodical, indifferent to drama. The suspect listened too. Occasionally there was a flicker, annoyance, disbelief, something like regret. But no outburst came. No dramatic denial. Silence, it seemed, had become a habit, one that felt safer than explanation. The years had taught that silence could protect, could outlast outrage, could turn suspicion into background noise. What the years had not accounted for was persistence. Outside the courtroom, the family waited, not together, not speaking, each of them alone with their own version of what justice might look like. For some, it was a verdict. For others, it was acknowledgement. The simple fact that the story was being told out loud, in a room where it could no longer be ignored, was already more than they had been promised for most of their lives. As testimony continued, a pattern emerged that no single witness could have created. It was a pattern of a life subtly redirected by one night, relationships that never deepened, jobs that ended abruptly, a restlessness that never settled. The prosecution did not call it guilt. They let the jury name it themselves. The defense pressed harder, pointing out the absence of confession, the lack of a single, undeniable piece of evidence. They asked the jury to consider doubt as an act of fairness. It was a compelling argument. Justice, after all, demanded caution. But caution had already ruled this case for 40 years. And caution, unchecked, had become neglect. When closing arguments came, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if time itself had condensed into those final hours. The prosecution spoke of responsibility, not revenge, of truth, not punishment. They reminded the jury that silence is not neutral, that doing nothing is also a choice, one that shapes lives as surely as action. The jury deliberated longer than anyone expected. Hours passed, then days. The waiting reopened wounds that had barely begun to scar over. Every knock on the door, every update from the bailiff, carried the possibility of collapse. The family braced themselves, knowing that even now, after all this, the truth could still slip away. When the verdict was finally read, it landed without ceremony. No gasps, no cheers, just a collective exhale, heavy and uneven. Guilty. The word did not feel victorious. It felt final. It felt like a sentence spoken not just over one person, but over 4 decades of unanswered questions. The suspect did not react. No visible anger. No tears. Just a slight tightening of the jaw, a nod that could have meant anything or nothing. Perhaps they had known this moment was coming all along. Perhaps they had believed it never would. Either way, the waiting was over. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. The legal process would continue its slow, deliberate grind. But something fundamental had shifted. The story was no longer unresolved. It had a shape now, an ending that, while imperfect, existed. For the family, the days that followed were strange, disorienting. They were no longer the ones who waited. They were no longer suspended in uncertainty, but they were also not whole. Truth did not restore what had been taken. It simply stopped the bleeding. In Ohio, the case became a reference point, a reminder. Detectives spoke of it in hushed tones, not as a triumph, but as a warning. Evidence does not expire. Silence is not safety. Time does not absolve. It only delays. And somewhere in the quiet that followed the verdict, the past finally loosened its grip. Not completely, not kindly, but enough to allow the future to move again. After the verdict, the courthouse emptied slowly, as if no one trusted the ground outside to feel real. Reporters spoke into microphones with rehearsed gravity, but their words sounded thin compared to the weight inside the building. The cameras captured faces, reactions, fragments of history compressed into sound bites, yet none of it could fully explain what it meant for truth to surface after being submerged for 40 years. This was not an ending. It was a release of pressure. The family did not celebrate. They drove home in silence, passing familiar roads that suddenly felt unfamiliar, altered by the knowledge that the unknown had finally been named. For decades, those roads had carried questions. Now they carried something heavier, confirmation. The truth had a texture. It was rough, uneven, harder to hold than hope had ever been. In the days that followed, memories resurfaced with an intensity that surprised them. Not new memories, but sharper versions of old ones. Conversations replayed, decisions reconsidered. Moments once dismissed as coincidence returned with new meaning. Closure, they learned, was not a door that closed cleanly. It was a room that had finally been lit, revealing everything that had been inside all along. For investigators, the case entered a different phase. The urgency faded, replaced by review. They went back through the file, not to question the outcome, but to understand the journey. Where had it stalled? Where had it almost broken? What had been missed not because of malice, but because of assumption? The answers were uncomfortable. They always were. One pattern stood out. The early focus had been narrow, shaped by the limitations of the time and the pressure to resolve quickly. When leads failed to produce immediate results, they were deprioritized. When witnesses hesitated, their uncertainty was mistaken for irrelevance. The case did not go cold all at once. It cooled gradually, one decision at a time, until it was no longer anyone's responsibility. Training sessions began to reference the case without names. Instructors spoke of it as an example of patience and persistence, but also of humility. Technology had played its role, but technology alone had not solved it. What reopened the case was a question that refused to stay quiet. Why was this dismissed? Why was that overlooked? Why assume the story was finished when the evidence never said it was? The convicted individual was transferred to a facility hours away. The ride was uneventful. No statements were made. No final words offered. The silence that had defined the past continued into the present, now stripped of its power. Silence, once protective, now meant nothing. Letters began to arrive at the family's home. Some from strangers who remembered the original headlines. Others from people who had lived nearby, carrying guilt for not speaking sooner, for not pushing harder, for assuming someone else would act. The family read them slowly, unsure how to respond. Forgiveness felt complicated. Responsibility felt shared. At night, sleep came unevenly. Dreams blurred time, merging the past and present into a single restless landscape. The truth had answered the question of who, but it left behind the harder question of why. Why that night? Why that moment? Why a decision that would ripple outward for decades? There were no satisfying answers. There rarely were. The community adjusted in its own way. Conversations at diners and grocery stores shifted tone. What had once been speculation became reflection. People spoke about how close danger can be without announcing itself, how familiarity can disguise intent. Parents held their children a little tighter. Trust was not withdrawn, but it was recalibrated. Years of myth fell away. The case had inspired rumors, theories, whispered explanations that filled a vacuum left by uncertainty. With the truth exposed, those stories lost their grip. They were replaced not by peace, but by clarity. And clarity, while less comforting than fantasy, was more honest. The legal process continued, as it always does. Appeals were filed. Motions argued. The machinery of justice moved forward with deliberate indifference to emotion. For the family, this phase felt distant, procedural. The core truth had already been acknowledged. Whatever happened next would not change that. One afternoon, a detective who had worked the reopened case stood alone in the evidence room, looking at the shelf where the box had once gathered dust. The space was empty now. The file had been archived again, but this time with finality. The detective felt no triumph, only relief, mixed with a quiet resolve to never let another case disappear so completely. Cold cases, they knew, were not defined by time. They were defined by attention. When attention fades, truth waits. Patient, unforgiving. Ready? The Ohio case became a marker, a line drawn between what had been accepted and what would no longer be tolerated. It did not promise that every mystery would be solved. It promised only that silence would be challenged, no matter how long it had been allowed to settle. And as the seasons changed, as anniversaries passed with new understanding attached to them, the story settled into its final shape. Not neat, not satisfying, but real. The truth had arrived late, but it had arrived. The month that followed carried a strange duality, a sense of motion wrapped around stillness. On paper, everything was progressing. Documents filed, hearings scheduled, timelines enforced, but emotionally, it felt as if the world had paused to catch its breath. The case had been solved, yes, but resolution did not behave like an event. It behaved like weather, slowly altering the landscape, changing how everything felt beneath the surface. The family learned this first. They discovered that knowing the truth did not quiet the mind. It sharpened it. Details once blurred by uncertainty now stood in stark relief. They remembered the sound of the phone ringing back in 1981, the weight of the silence that followed, the way their lives had subtly reoriented around an absence that had never been explained. Now that absence had a cause, and causes demand reckoning. They revisited old places, not out of nostalgia, but compulsion. The street where it had begun, the parking lot that no longer existed, the building repurposed, renovated, stripped of its history. They stood there quietly, not speaking, letting the present settle over the past like sediment. Nothing dramatic happened, no revelation, just the understanding that time does not erase impact. It layers it. Inside law enforcement circles, the case triggered deeper conversations, not public ones, private, uncomfortable ones, about clearance rates, about pressure, about how many cases had quietly slipped into the same limbo because they did not fit a narrative that could be solved quickly. Veterans spoke candidly with rookies, not to frighten them, but to anchor them. This is what happens when patience runs out before truth does. The forensic work was reviewed again, not to strengthen conviction, but to understand the limits of what had been relied upon. Experts debated probabilities, margins, thresholds. It became clear that science had not delivered certainty. It had delivered permission to look again, permission to doubt earlier conclusions, permission to reopen a door that had been labeled closed for decades without ever being locked. The convicted individual remained silent. No interviews, no statements, no public attempt to explain or justify. Some interpreted this as guilt solidified, others as defiance. But silence, by then, had lost its mystery. It no longer invited speculation. It simply existed, empty of influence. The appeals process unfolded predictably. Arguments about degraded evidence, about witness reliability, about the impossibility of fairness after so much time. Judges listened, considered, responded with measured rulings that acknowledged delay without excusing it. The conviction stood, not because time had been ignored, but because it had been accounted for. For the family, this affirmation was quieter than the verdict itself. There were no cameras, no calls, just a letter. Official, plain, final. They sat together when they read it, letting the words settle. This was as close to certainty as they would ever get. And for the first time in 40 years, there was nothing left to wait for. Grief shifted shape. It did not lessen. It reorganized. It became less volatile, more reflective. Anger dulled into sadness. Sadness matured into something like acceptance, though none of them would have used that word. Acceptance felt too clean. What they felt was endurance rewarded. not with peace, but with truth. The community moved on as communities do. New stories replaced old ones. Headlines faded, but the case lingered in subtle ways. In the way people hesitated before dismissing something as insignificant. In the way tips were taken seriously, no matter how late they arrived. In the way silence was treated not as absence, but as potential. One evening, years later, a young detective sat alone at a desk, scrolling through archive cases, stopping occasionally, reading names that no longer appeared in the news. The Ohio case stood out, not because of its resolution, but because of its age. 40 years. Long enough for entire lives to unfold. Long enough for truth to seem optional. And yet, here it was, found, proven, unavoidable. The detective closed the file and leaned back, understanding something that no manual could teach. That justice is not defined by speed. That delay does not negate responsibility. That answers do not expire simply because waiting becomes uncomfortable. Somewhere else, far from the courthouse and the records and the debates, the family gathered again, not for a hearing, not for an anniversary, just a meal. Conversation drifted, laughter surfaced, tentative at first, then real. Life, which had been paused in certain ways for decades, had begun to move forward again, not because the past was gone, but because it had finally been named. The case had taught them all the same lesson, though none would have phrased it the same way. The truth does not demand attention. It waits for it, and when it finally receives it, it does not ask whether it is too late. It only asks whether anyone is still listening. By the time the sentencing date arrived, the urgency that once drove the case had transformed into something quieter, heavier, almost ritualistic. There was no suspense left in the outcome, only gravity. The courtroom filled again, but this time the air was different. The question was no longer whether the truth would surface. It was how that truth would be acknowledged, how it would be measured, how a single decision made in 1981 would be translated into consequence 4 decades later. The judge spoke slowly, deliberately, as if aware that every word would echo backward through time. The sentence was read not as punishment alone, but as recognition. Recognition that harm does not dissolve with age. Recognition that silence does not equal innocence. Recognition that the passage of time, while it dulls memory, sharpens responsibility. The sentence did not feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. The convicted individual stood, listened, and sat again. No statement was offered. The opportunity was there. It always is. But some people reach the end of the road still believing that explanation is a kind of surrender. The court did not wait for words that would never come. It moved forward without them. Outside, there were no crowds, no protests, no spectacle. The story had already burned through the public consciousness. What remained was residue, not fire. Reporters filed their final updates. Editors moved on. The case slipped quietly out of the headlines, not because it mattered less, but because its work was done. For the family, sentencing brought a strange calm, not relief, not satisfaction. Calm, the kind that arrives when uncertainty is finally exhausted. They no longer imagined alternate endings. They no longer rehearsed conversations that would never happen. The future, once overshadowed by an unanswered past, felt open again, not bright, but accessible. They began to speak differently about the lost loved one, not as a symbol of injustice, but as a person. Stories surfaced that had been buried beneath anger and frustration. Small habits, private jokes, ordinary moments reclaimed from the shadow of the crime. The truth had given them permission to remember without bitterness. Law enforcement took note of something else. Tips began arriving for other cold cases. Not immediately, gradually. People who had carried quiet suspicion for years reached out, emboldened by the idea that time did not disqualify truth. Some tips went nowhere. Others reopened doors that had been closed too quickly. The Ohio case became a signal, not a solution. In training rooms, instructors paused longer on certain slides. Evidence handling, interview notes, follow-up procedures. The lesson was not that every case could be solved decades later. The lesson was that every case deserved to be treated as if it might be. Assumptions, they emphasized, aged poorly. Curiosity does not. The forensic lab archived the materials one final time. Samples that had traveled from cardboard boxes to climate-controlled vaults were sealed, labeled, logged. Their journey was complete. They had done what they were meant to do. Not loudly, not dramatically, but faithfully. Evidence, when respected, does not rush. It waits. The convicted individual settled into routine. Days structured by rules. Time marked not by seasons, but by schedules. Whatever thoughts existed about the past remained unspoken. The silence continued, but it no longer defined the story. It had become background noise, irrelevant to the truth already established. Years passed. The case was referenced less frequently, then rarely, then only when someone asked how long justice could really wait. The answer was never simple. Justice did not wait. People did. Evidence did. Truth did. Justice arrived when those elements finally aligned. On an unremarkable afternoon, one of the original investigators, long retired, received a letter from the family. It was brief. No accusations. No gratitude heavy enough to feel obligatory. Just acknowledgement. You didn't let it disappear. That was enough. The investigator read it twice, then folded it carefully, understanding that this was the only kind of closure the job ever really offered. The Ohio case did not rewrite history. It clarified it. It did not heal every wound. It stopped new ones from forming. It did not promise that patience would always be rewarded. It proved that impatience always exacts a cost. In the quiet spaces left behind, empty offices, archived files, repurposed buildings, the case continued to exist not as an open question, but as a reminder that time does not decide what matters. Attention does. And when attention returns, no matter how late, the truth is always ready to meet it. The story moved forward, not because the past had loosened its grip entirely, but because it had finally been held, examined, and understood. And in that understanding, something shifted, not just for one family, not just for one community, but for every unanswered case still waiting in the dark. Time did what it always does after the noise fades. It spread the story thin, stretched it across routines and ordinary days until it no longer announced itself. The Ohio case became something people remembered only when prompted, when a headline elsewhere echoed its shape, when another long unsolved mystery surfaced and reminded everyone that certainty is not a matter of speed. The work, however, did not stop. It changed form. Inside police departments far beyond Ohio, the case was quietly circulated. Not as a press release, as a file, as a study. Detectives read it late at night, between active cases, drawn not by the outcome but by the patients embedded in every page. They noticed how close to truth had been in the early years, how many times it had almost been reached and then set aside because it felt incomplete, inconvenient, unprovable by the standards of its time. Those standards became a topic of debate. What qualifies as enough? What gets dismissed as circumstantial? How certainty is often confused with simplicity. The Ohio case demonstrated something unsettling. The truth had always been complex. It was a demand for simplicity that delayed it. Families with their own unresolved losses watched closely. Some found comfort. Others felt resentment. Why this case? Why now? Why not ours? There were no satisfying answers. Justice, when it arrives late, does not distribute itself evenly. It arrives where attention, evidence, and persistence intersect. The rest continue to wait. The family at the center of it all felt this tension acutely. They became cautious symbols, referenced in articles, quoted in documentaries, spoken about as examples of endurance. But they were not interested in becoming a lesson. They were interested in living. Slowly, deliberately, they reclaimed parts of their lives that had been paused indefinitely. They changed routines, traveled, made plans that extended further into the future than they ever had before. For decades, the future had felt provisional, something to be navigated carefully in case the past demanded attention again. Now, for the first time, it felt stable enough to trust. Still, the past surfaced unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a photograph found in a drawer, a smell that returned them instantly to 1981. These moments no longer carried the same sharpness, but they still demanded acknowledgement. Healing, they learned, was not about forgetting. It was about integrating. In law enforcement archives, other cases stirred. Files were reopened not because of new technology alone, but because of a renewed willingness to look foolish, to question previous conclusions, to admit that something might have been missed. Pride, long an obstacle, began to loosen its grip. The Ohio case had demonstrated that reopening was not an admission of failure. It was an act of respect for the victim, for the evidence, for the idea that truth is not obligated to reveal itself on schedule. One case, decades old, involved a single witness statement dismissed as unreliable. Another hinged on a piece of physical evidence deemed too contaminated to matter. In both instances, investigators asked a simple question that had not been asked before. What if we were wrong? The question did not guarantee answers. It guaranteed effort. The convicted individual faded from public consciousness. Prison routines replaced speculation. Years passed without incident. Silence, once strategic, became irrelevant. The story no longer required their voice. It had outgrown it. Occasionally, someone would ask the family whether forgiveness had followed the truth. The question always landed awkwardly. Forgiveness implied a resolution they did not feel qualified to grant. What they felt was clarity. And clarity, they found, was more useful than absolution. The community adjusted further. The place where the crime had begun was no longer avoided. It was no longer charged with rumor. It existed again as geography, not mythology. Children passed through unaware of the history beneath their feet. That, oddly, felt right. Anniversaries came and went without ceremony. No statements were released. No reflections offered publicly. The family marked them privately, sometimes not at all. Time, now that it was no longer an adversary, could be treated casually. The Ohio case began to do its quiet work in the background, shaping instincts, influencing decisions in ways that were never documented. A detective chose to follow up on a tip that felt thin. A supervisor approved additional testing instead of closing a file. A witness was given time instead of pressure. None of these moments referenced Ohio explicitly. They didn't need to. The truth had already done what it needed to do. It had changed behavior. Years later, when asked about the case, one investigator described it simply. It reminded us that evidence has a memory longer than ours. That time is not a shield. That silence is not proof of absence. The statement circulated briefly, then disappeared into the steady churn of new stories. But somewhere in a storage room, in a database, in a conversation yet to happen, the lesson remained. Waiting, patient, ready, because the Ohio case was never just about one crime. It was about what happens when the world decides not to look away. The longer the story existed without noise, the more powerful its influence became. It no longer needed headlines to announce itself. It lived instead in instinct, in hesitation, in the quiet moments where someone chose not to close a file, not to dismiss a detail, not to assume that time had done the work for them. The Ohio case had slipped into the bloodstream of the system, altering how people thought rather than what they said. In the family's home, life continued in ways that felt both ordinary and unfamiliar. There were mornings that arrived without the familiar weight of anticipation, without the reflexive checking of phones, without the sense that something unresolved might suddenly demand attention. That absence of tension felt strange at first, like a muscle no longer clenched. They learned to trust it slowly. Conversations shifted. They spoke less about the case itself and more about the years surrounding it. Childhood memories resurfaced that had nothing to do with loss. Stories that had been postponed until the truth arrived were finally told. Laughter came easier, not because the past had softened, but because it no longer dominated every emotional calculation. There were still moments of anger. They came without warning. In traffic, in crowds, in quiet rooms late at night. Anger at the years stolen, at the simplicity of the decision that had caused it all, at how easily life had continued for someone else while theirs had been defined by waiting. These moments did not undo progress. They reminded them that healing was not linear. It did not move forward cleanly. It circled. It returned. It evolved. In court records, the case settled into its final posture. Appeals exhausted. Motions denied. The language became procedural, unemotional. The system, having done its work, moved on. This was not indifference. It was design. Justice was not meant to linger. It was meant to resolve and release. Yet the release was uneven for investigators who had worked the reopened case. There was a residual restlessness. Success brought no relief, only awareness. If this case could wait 40 years, how many others were waiting too? The thought followed them into new investigations, into decisions made under pressure. It sharpened their skepticism of easy answers. Cold case units received increased funding in some jurisdictions, not as a direct response, but as part of a broader shift in thinking. The Ohio case had demonstrated value, not just moral value, but institutional value. Truth recovered late was still truth recovered. Trust restored was still trust restored. That mattered. Community members who had once avoided speaking about the crime began to share their own stories, not about this case, but about others. Incidents never reported, suspicions never voiced. The atmosphere changed subtly. Silence lost its assumed safety. Speaking, even imperfectly, became less intimidating. The family noticed this shift too. They received messages from people they had never met, thanking them not for their patience, but for their visibility, for continuing to exist openly in a space that often preferred quiet suffering. The family did not respond to most of these messages. Gratitude felt unnecessary. They had not chosen this role. It had chosen them. Years after the verdict, one member of the family returned to a box that had not been opened since the early 1990s. Inside were letters written during the long silence, unsent, unfinished. Pages filled with questions that had never been answered at the time. They read them slowly, recognizing the voice of someone suspended in uncertainty. The letters felt distant, almost foreign. They were evidence of survival, not despair. The past, once so loud, had learned to speak softly. It no longer demanded attention. It offered context. In a different part of the state, a detective stared at a case board late one night, surrounded by photographs, timelines, fragments that refused to align. Frustration mounted. The urge to close the file pressed in. And then, unprompted, the Ohio case surfaced in memory. Not the details, but the feeling. The reminder that alignment does not announce itself. It accumulates. The detective stayed, looked again, asked one more question. This was how the case continued to exist, not as a story retold, but as a decision repeated. The convicted individual aged quietly, measured not by notoriety, but by routine. Time, which had once been an ally, now moved with indifferent regularity. Whatever version of the past existed in their mind remained private. The world no longer required access to it. The record spoke clearly enough. As decades continued their forward march, the Ohio case drifted further into history. New crimes, new mysteries, new tragedies filled the space it once occupied. Yet beneath that constant churn, something had changed. The assumption that some answers were permanently lost had weakened. The truth had proven itself stubborn, patient, willing to wait. And those who had lived through its delay understood something that could not be taught quickly or easily. That resolution does not restore what was taken. That justice does not rewind time. But that knowing, even late, even imperfectly, alters the shape of everything that follows. The Ohio case had not given the world peace. It had given it permission to keep looking. Night did not arrive gently in Ohio. It pressed down, heavy and deliberate, as if the darkness itself remembered what had happened decades earlier and refused to forget. Streetlights hummed. Houses slept. Somewhere between routine and memory. The case continued to breathe, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently, like a pulse beneath the floorboards of state. Long after the verdict, long after microphones were packed away, the emotional geography of the case kept shifting. Truth had arrived, but it did not settle evenly. It pooled in unexpected places. It drained from others. For the family, there were days when clarity felt almost unreal, like waking from a dream you had been trapped inside for 40 years and discovering the room had changed while you slept. They began to notice how silence sounded different now. Before it had been loaded, brittle, filled with anticipation. Now it was quieter, softer, sometimes even kind. The absence of uncertainty created space, and space invited reflection. They reflected not only on what had happened, but on who they had been while waiting, the versions of themselves shaped by not knowing, the habits formed around grief that had no ending. Photographs were taken down from walls and looked at again, not as evidence, not as reminders of injustice, but as moments frozen before everything fractured. Smiles were studied, background details noticed for the first time, a chipped mug, a crooked picture frame, proof that life had once existed without the shadow of a cold case stretching across it. In the broader community, the story lingered like a rumor that refused to fade. People spoke about it in lowered voices, not out of fear but respect. It had become one of those stories that parents mentioned to teenagers as cautionary tales, not about danger alone, but about time, about consequences that could outlast entire lifetimes. Local journalists revisited their old notebooks. Some were surprised by how much they had missed the first time. Others were struck by how the language had changed. Early articles were filled with speculation, with urgency, with the need to fill gaps. Later ones were restrained, almost clinical. The difference told its own story about patience, about how restraint sometimes delivered what urgency never could. For law enforcement, the case became a benchmark, not a trophy, not a triumph, but a reference point. During training sessions, instructors spoke about it not to inspire heroics, but discipline. They emphasized a forgotten detail, the overlooked record, the assumption that something too small to matter could safely be ignored. The Ohio case dismantled that assumption piece by piece. Some officers who had worked the reopening struggled privately. Closure did not erase the emotional toll of immersion. They had lived inside someone else's tragedy for years, absorbing its gravity. Stepping out of it felt disorienting. A few sought counseling. Others leaned into routine. The system offered support, quietly acknowledging that solving the case did not immunize anyone from its weight. The convicted individual's name faded from conversation. The family did not speak it. The community rarely did, not out of denial, but because fixation felt unnecessary. Accountability had been established. Obsession served no purpose. The focus shifted instead to what had been learned, what had been altered, what could be prevented. Time continued its work, relentless and impartial. Birthdays arrived without the ache of unanswered questions. Holidays came without the ritual of empty chairs, carrying symbolic meaning. There was still grief, but it had edges now. It could be held. It could be placed down. One family member began volunteering with organizations that supported victims' relatives navigating unresolved cases. They listened more than they spoke. When they did speak, they avoided platitudes. They did not promise closure. They offered endurance. They explained that truth, if it came, would not arrive cleanly, but would arrive with power, and that even without it, life could still expand, slowly, stubbornly. In archives across the state, old files were requested more frequently. Students, researchers, amateur historians wanted to understand how something so significant could have remained unresolved for so long. They traced the paper trail, noting where it thinned, where assumptions replaced verification. The case became a lesson in institutional memory, and what happens when it erodes. At night, in houses far removed from the original crime scene, people lay awake thinking about the idea of time itself, about how many versions of the truth can exist before the real one emerges, about how memory distorts when it is left alone too long. The Ohio case had introduced these questions into the collective consciousness, subtle but persistent. The family noticed strangers, recognizing them less often. Faces that once looked twice now passed without pause. Anonymity returned gradually, almost shyly. With it came a sense of relief tinged with uncertainty. Visibility had been armor. Invisibility felt vulnerable. They adjusted. They began making plans that extended further into the future than they ever had before. Vacations, renovations, commitments that assumed continuity rather than interruption. The future, once fragile, now felt sturdier, not guaranteed, but plausible. In a quiet moment, one of them stood at the edge of the town where it had all begun. The geography looked unchanged. Roads still curved the same way. Buildings stood where memory placed them. And yet everything felt different. The past no longer pressed against the present. It sat behind it, acknowledged, integrated. There was no cinematic ending, no final revelation that redefined everything. The impact was cumulative, not explosive. It unfolded across conversations, decisions, moments of hesitation and resolve. That was the truth of it. Justice rarely arrives with spectacle. It arrives with persistence. As years continued to pass, the case became less about what had happened in 1981 and more about what happened afterward. The decades of uncertainty, the resilience required to endure them, the systems challenged, the assumptions broken, the quiet insistence that something unresolved is not something finished. In courtrooms, in classrooms, in living rooms, the stories serve as a reminder that waiting does not equal forgetting, that silence does not equal absence, that evidence, like memory, can survive neglect if not destroyed outright. The Ohio case had been solved, but it had not ended. It had transformed. It existed now as a shadow behind every open file, every hesitant witness, every detective who paused before dismissing a detail as insignificant. It whispered caution. It demanded patience. It insisted that truth, no matter how delayed, carried weight. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between past and present, that weight continued to shape the future, unseen but undeniable, pressing forward, reminding everyone who listened that time may bury answers, but it does not erase them. Morning came without ceremony. No sirens, no headlines breaking across screens, no urgent phone calls. Just daylight sliding through curtains, illuminating rooms that had carried the weight of waiting for 4 decades. In Ohio, the case had entered a strange new phase, one that no one had prepared for. Resolution did not arrive like an ending. It arrived like an echo, repeating itself in ordinary moments when no one expected it. The family learned that truth does not immediately rewrite memory. It sits beside it. Old habits of thought lingered. There were still moments when someone reached the phone to call a number that had been disconnected since the early 80s. Still moments when footsteps in a hallway triggered a reflexive pause. The mind, trained for uncertainty, did not instantly trust certainty. In legal circles, the case was dissected quietly, methodically. Prosecutors spoke about chain of custody. Defense attorneys debated timelines that had aged beyond relevance. Judges referenced the matter in chambers, not as precedent alone, but as a warning. Evidence ignored is evidence delayed. Delayed evidence reshapes lives. Everyone in the system felt the implications settle like dust. The media cycle moved on, as it always does. New cases replaced old ones. New tragedies competed for attention. But this one lingered in the background, resurfacing in anniversary pieces, in long-form podcasts, in academic journals focused on wrongful delay rather than wrongful conviction. It became less about spectacle and more about responsibility. In the town where it began, older residents noticed subtle shifts. Conversations once avoided were now spoken aloud. Names were said without hesitation. Rumors that had survived on half information finally collapsed under the weight of confirmed fact. The community recalibrated its collective memory, adjusting long-held assumptions, some with relief, others with discomfort. There were those who struggled to accept the outcome, not because they doubted the truth, but because the truth disrupted narratives they had lived with for most of their lives. Belief, once entrenched, resists correction. The case revealed that justice does not only confront perpetrators. It confronts bystanders, institutions, and the stories people tell themselves to feel safe. For investigators involved in the final push, the silence after resolution was the hardest part. No more files to open, no more leads to chase. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind exhaustion and a hollow sense of purpose fulfilled. Some described it as standing at the edge of a long road after finishing a marathon, unsure where to step next. They replayed decisions in their heads. What if this had been found sooner? What if the technology had arrived earlier? What if someone had looked twice instead of once? These questions had no answers, only lessons. Lessons they carried into every subsequent case, every evidence room, every late-night review. The family marked the passage of time differently now. Anniversaries once observed with dread were redefined. They were no longer countdowns to disappointment. They became markers of survival, proof that endurance had meaning, even when outcome was uncertain. One evening, a box was opened that had remained sealed for decades. Inside were letters written but never sent, addressed to someone who had been gone too long to read them. The handwriting had aged. The ink had faded, but the words remained sharp, intimate, raw. They were read aloud, not as pleas, but as history, as testimony to the cost of not knowing. In classrooms across Ohio, professors spoke about the case when discussing criminal procedure. Students listened differently than previous generations. They were less interested in sensational details and more focused on process, on how systems fail quietly, on how persistence, not brilliance, often solve what seems unsolvable. The case also altered how families of missing persons viewed their own waiting. Some found renewed hope. Others found validation for their grief. The Ohio story did not promise resolution. It promised acknowledgement. It said, "Your waiting is seen. Your questions are legitimate. Time alone does not close cases. People do." At night, the town settled into routines that no longer felt interrupted by speculation. The streets were the same, the houses unchanged, but the air felt lighter, as if something long suspended had finally been allowed to land. The truth, once buried, had emerged not with violence, but with persistence. It had moved slowly, deliberately, through layers of neglect and doubt, until it could no longer be ignored. And when it surfaced, it did not erase the past. It clarified it. This was the legacy of the Ohio case. Not just that it was solved, but that it proved something essential, that silence can be broken without noise, that answers can arrive without spectacle, that even after 4 decades, the truth still has the power to rearrange lives. And as the state moved forward, file by file, case by case, that understanding remained steady and unyielding, a reminder that no matter how long a mystery sleeps, it is never truly gone. Night settled differently after the truth surfaced. It no longer felt like an absence pressing against windows, but a presence that asked to be acknowledged. In Ohio, darkness had always carried the weight of the unknown, the kind that makes clocks sound louder and memories sharpen their edges. Now, the dark held something else, an afterimage of answers finally spoken, and the uneasy realization that knowing does not quiet everything. It rearranges the noise. The house where the waiting had lived for 40 years creaked as it always had, but the sounds no longer triggered the same reflexes. Floorboards were just wood again, not signals. Shadows were just shadows, not questions pacing the hallway. And yet, sleep did not come easily. Closure, it turned out, does not sedate the mind. It wakes it up. The truth had arrived late, carrying the smell of old paper and dust, carried by hands that trembled not from fear, but from recognition. It was not dramatic. No doors kicked in. No flashing lights. Just a file opened, a match confirmed, a phone call delivered with clinical care. The kind of moment that history later exaggerates, but those who live it remember as unbearably quiet. For the family, the revelation fractured time. The past rushed forward, colliding with the present. They remembered arguments that no longer mattered, words spoken in frustration that now felt cruel, days when hope had been rationed because disappointment hurt less that way. The mind replayed everything, searching for missed signals, reinterpreting old moments through a new lens. Grief did not diminish. It sharpened, becoming more specific, more real. Outside, the community watched from a respectful distance. People who had grown up hearing whispers now spoke in full sentences. They adjusted their understanding, reshaping decades of assumption. Some felt guilt for what they had believed. Others felt relief that the unease they carried had not been unfounded. The case had lived in them too, a low hum beneath daily life, and its resolution sent a ripple through routines that had long accommodated uncertainty. The investigators who had reopened the file felt the weight settle in their chests. They were trained to celebrate results, to mark victories with paperwork and procedure. But this felt different. There was no joy in being right after so long. Only gravity. Only the knowledge that persistence had outlived doubt, that truth had waited patiently for someone stubborn enough to keep listening. They reviewed the path that led here, step by step, not to congratulate themselves, but to understand the delay, why this evidence slept, why that note was misfiled, why a fingerprint had been overlooked in an era before automation made comparison effortless. Each answer carried an echo of responsibility, a reminder that systems are only as vigilant as the people inside them. In court records, the case transformed from a mystery into a timeline. Dates replaced speculation. Actions replaced rumors. The story narrowed, becoming precise and unforgiving. It left little room for myth. That precision mattered. It honored the truth by refusing to dramatize it, by allowing facts to stand on their own, unadorned and undeniable. The family sat with that precision, absorbing it slowly. They learned details they had never imagined, details they wished they could forget. Knowledge can be a double-edged thing. It cuts through lies, but it also cuts into hope, revealing just how much had been lost. They balanced gratitude for answers with the ache of finality. There would be no more wondering, but there would also be no alternate endings left to imagine. In the days that followed, objects took on new meaning. A jacket, kept in the back of a closet. A photograph that had once been a placeholder for absence. These items no longer represented question. They represented a chapter, closed but still alive with memory. The family touched them carefully, as if they might speak. The town returned to its rhythm, but something subtle had shifted. There was a new awareness in conversations about other unsolved cases, other families still waiting. The Ohio story became a reference point, not as a promise, but as proof. Proof that persistence can outlast neglect. That answers can surface even when the trail feels cold beyond recovery. Law enforcement agencies took notice. Quiet changes followed. Old boxes were reopened. Storage rooms were re-examined. Files once labeled dormant were marked active again, not because technology alone had advanced, but because belief had. The belief that time does not erase responsibility. That unresolved does not mean unsolvable. At home, the family gathered one evening without an agenda. No reporters. No officials. Just shared space. They spoke about ordinary things. Weather, work, plans, and in between, without announcement, they spoke the name that had once been too heavy to say aloud. It did not break the room. It grounded it. They understood now that the truth had not ended the story. It had changed its function. What was once an open wound became a scar. Still sensitive, still visible, but no longer bleeding. Scars do not disappear. They remind. They teach. They prove survival. As years continued their march forward, the case receded from headlines but not from memory. It lived on in policy discussions, in training modules, in the quiet resolve of detectives who refused to let another file gather dust. It lived on in families who saw in the story a reflection of their own waiting and a reason not to surrender to silence. The Ohio case did something rare. It reminded people that justice is not always swift, but it can be stubborn. That truth does not require spectacle to matter. That even after 4 decades, it can still arrive with enough force to change lives, to reorder narratives, to bring a measure of peace that once seemed impossible. And in the end, when the house grew quiet again and night returned to its place, it no longer felt like a void. It felt like rest, like the long-held breath finally released, like a mystery that had traveled through time, carried by patience and persistence, finally laid to rest, not forgotten, but understood. Time did not stop after the answers arrived. It accelerated in strange ways, compressing decades of silence into moments of reckoning. In Ohio, the case no longer lived in file numbers or faded ink, but in conversations that surfaced unexpectedly, at dinner tables, in quiet car rides, in the pauses between sentences where someone almost said something, then decided not to. The truth had become part of daily life, not as a headline, but as an undercurrent. For the family, mornings carried a different weight. Waking up no longer meant bracing for uncertainty, but adjusting to certainty itself. There was a discipline to that adjustment. They had spent 40 years training their hearts to survive without answers, to function inside ambiguity. Now they had to relearn how to live with clarity, with a story that had an ending even if it was not the one they would have chosen. That transition was not gentle. It came with flashes of anger, with moments of disbelief that returned uninvited. With the strange guilt of feeling relief at all, they revisited places they had avoided for years. A street corner, a stretch of road, a building that had once been impossible to pass without tightening the chest. These locations had been suspended in time, Frozen at the moment everything changed. Now, walking through them felt like crossing a threshold. Nothing looked different, yet everything was. The past no longer owned these spaces completely. The present had reclaimed them. Investigators, too, carried the case forward in unexpected ways. Training sessions referenced it not as a triumph, but as a lesson, a reminder that small details matter, that evidence does not expire, that assumptions can calcify into obstacles. Younger officers listened closely, recognizing that they were inheriting not just procedures, but responsibility. Responsibility to question, responsibility to persist, responsibility to the families whose lives intersected with their decisions. In records rooms and digital databases, the Ohio case became a marker, before and after. It influenced how cold cases were categorized, how evidence was preserved, how long unsolved was allowed to mean inactive. The fingerprint that slept for decades became symbolic. Not a failure, but potential waiting for the right moment. Technology had evolved, yes, but so had mindset. That evolution mattered just as much. The community's reaction matured with time. Initial shock gave way to reflection. People reconsidered their own memories, their own roles as bystanders to the story that unfolded quietly alongside their lives. Some recalled moments when they might have spoken up, shared a suspicion, followed a hunch. Regrets surfaced, but it was tempered by understanding. The past could not be rewritten, only learned from. Media attention faded, as it always does, but the story lingered in local identity. It became part of Ohio's collective memory, told not with sensationalism, but with solemn respect. Teachers reference it when discussing justice. Parents reference it when explaining patience. It became a cautionary tale and a hopeful one at the same time. For the family, the hardest moments often came unannounced. A song on the radio, a scent carried on the air, a date on the calendar that no longer required explanation but still demanded acknowledgement. They allowed themselves to feel whatever surfaced. Sadness, anger, gratitude. There was no hierarchy anymore. All emotions were valid now that secrecy had been replaced with truth. They spoke openly about the person they lost, not as a mystery, but as a human being fully realized again. Stories once shared in whispers were told aloud. Laughter returned to memories that had long been heavy. The narrative expanded beyond the crime, beyond the loss, reclaiming years that had been overshadowed by a single unanswered question. Justice, they learned, is not a moment. It is a process that continues long after verdicts and confirmations. It lives in how truth is carried forward, how it shapes choices, how it honors those who were silenced. The Ohio case did not restore what was taken, but it restored something else, agency, the ability to say, this is what happened, and this is how we live with it now. As seasons change, the case settled into history, but it never vanished. It existed in archives and lessons, in the quiet resolve of those who refuse to forget. It stood as proof that time can obscure, but it cannot erase. That answers may arrive late, but when they do, they still matter. They still carry weight. They still change everything. And so the story continued, not as an open wound, but as a testament to persistence, to memory, to the idea that even after 40 years, truth can find its way back into the light, steady and undeniable, asking only that it be seen, acknowledged, and carried forward with care. By the time the story reached its 5th decade, it no longer announced itself with sirens or breaking news banners. It arrived quietly, like dusk settling over familiar streets, altering the shape of things without asking permission. In Ohio, the cold case had transformed from an event into a presence, something that lived alongside people rather than towering over them. It no longer demanded attention. It commanded reflection. The family noticed how strangers approached them differently now, not with a cautious sympathy reserved for unresolved tragedy, but with a gentler acknowledgement, a recognition that something heavy had finally been named. Conversations no longer stalled at the mention of the year 1981. The date had lost its sharp edge. It was still painful, but it no longer stopped time. They began sorting through belongings that had been sealed away for decades. Boxes labeled later. Drawers untouched since the early 80s. Inside were ordinary things, notes, receipts, photographs with curled edges. but each item carried the gravity of survival. These were artifacts of a life interrupted, and revisiting them felt like finishing a sentence that had been left hanging mid-word. There was grief in that process, but also continuity, proof that life had existed before the silence and could continue after it. The investigators who had worked the case reflected on the moment it finally shifted, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a realization, a connection made, a detail aligned. They spoke about how close the truth had been for years, hidden in plain sight, overlooked not out of malice but out of human limitation. That understanding reshaped how they viewed other unsolved cases. It sharpened their patience. It humbled their confidence. In training rooms, the Ohio case was dissected not for spectacle, but for discipline. Every misstep examined, every delay questioned. It became a blueprint for how not to let time become an excuse. Younger detectives absorbed these lessons, recognizing that they were inheriting both the burden and the hope embedded in unresolved files. The message was clear. Silence does not mean absence. The wider community carried its own reckoning. People revisited their memories of the early 80s, recalling where they were, what they believed, what they ignored. There was a collective acknowledgement that justice is not only the responsibility of institutions, but of individuals willing to speak when something feels wrong. That realization did not come with blame. It came with maturity. As years passed, the case found its way into conversations about reform, about evidence preservation, about victim advocacy, about the psychological toll of unresolved trauma. It influenced policy discussions quietly, steadily, without needing to be named every time. Its impact spread not through noise, but through persistence. For the family, anniversaries took on new meaning. They were no longer countdowns to nothing. They became moments of remembrance grounded in truth. Candles were still lit. Names were still spoken. But now there was context. Now there was an ending to stand beside the beginning. That balance mattered more than anyone outside the experience could fully understand. The person they lost was no longer defined by the mystery of their absence. They were remembered for who they were, not for how long answers took to arrive. Stories once dominated by fear were retold with warmth. The narrative expanded, reclaiming space from the crime itself. This was not forgetting. This was recentering. Justice, in its final form, did not resemble triumph. It resembled acceptance. Not passive, not resigned, but informed. The family understood that nothing could restore the past, but clarity had restored something essential: the right to move forward without doubt trailing every step. And so the Ohio cold case settled into its final chapter, not as a headline, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet marker in time, a reminder that truth does not age out, that memory has endurance, that even after 40 years, answers can still arrive with enough force to reshape lives. The silence that once defined the story no longer held power. What remained was understanding, and that understanding, hard-earned and long-delayed, continued to ripple outward, steady and unyielding, long after the case itself had finally come to rest. Long after files were closed and the official language shifted from unsolved to resolved, the case continued to speak in quieter ways. It spoke in habits changed, in instinct sharpened, in the way investigators paused an extra second before dismissing a detail, remembering Ohio, remembering how close the truth had been all along. The case had ended on paper, but its influence refused to stay contained. The family learned that closure is not a door that slams shut. It is a hallway, long unevenly lit. Some days they walked it with confidence, feeling grounded by answers that had once seemed impossible. Other days, they moved slowly, weighed down by memories that no revelation could soften. Both experiences were real. Both were part of the aftermath no one prepares you for. They discovered that grief does not disappear when truth arrives. It changes shape. It becomes less frantic, less desperate, but more layered, more reflective. There was space now to mourn what was lost without also fighting the terror of not knowing. That space was both a relief and a challenge. Silence, once an enemy, became something they had to learn to live with again, this time without fear. In private moments, they wondered who they might have been if the truth had come sooner. Different choices, different lives. That question lingered unanswered because it could never be resolved. Eventually, They learned to let it exist without demanding a solution. Some mysteries remain, even when the case itself is solved. The community shifted too, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The story became something people reference when talking about time, about patience, about justice delayed but not erased. It was no longer spoken with shock, but with respect, a shared understanding that some answers take decades, and that waiting does not mean failing. Local law enforcement carried the weight of the case into new investigations. Cold rooms were reorganized, evidence logs audited, processes questioned, not because policy demanded it, but because Ohio had taught them what complacency costs. The past had reached forward and altered the future. That, perhaps, was its most lasting contribution. The victim's name appeared less often in headlines, but more often in conversations where it mattered, in classrooms, in training seminars, in discussions about reform. Their story became part of a larger dialogue about accountability, about how systems can learn from their own blind spots. The person lost was no longer invisible. Their impact continued. For the family, the finality of the case did not mean the end of remembrance. It meant remembrance without uncertainty. They could speak openly, grieve openly, remember openly. The truth had removed the barrier that once made every memory feel incomplete. Now, memory could stand on its own. As years continued to pass, the case became history, but not distant history. It remained close enough to touch, close enough to teach. A reminder that time does not weaken truth. It only waits for someone willing to listen carefully enough. And in that listening, something essential endured. Not the crime, not the pain, but the insistence that even after decades of silence, the truth is still capable of changing lives. Quietly, profoundly, and forever. By the end, there was no single moment that felt like the ending. No final sentence spoken into a microphone that neatly sealed everything shut. What existed instead was a slow settling, like dust after a long collapse, revealing the shape of what had been there all along. The Ohio case did not conclude with triumph or spectacle. It concluded with stillness. The family learned that truth does not arrive as a gift. It arrives as a responsibility. Once known, it asked to be carried, integrated, lived with. They felt that weight in small moments, in the way holidays felt different, in how photographs were looked at longer than before, in the way silence no longer felt hostile but contemplative. The answers they had waited for decades for did not erase pain. They reframed it. There were nights when sleep came easily for the first time in years, and others when it didn't come at all. Both felt like progress. The mind, long conditioned to search endlessly, was relearning how to rest. The question that had once echoed relentlessly, what happened, had finally quieted. In its place was a softer, heavier realization. This is what happened, and now we choose how to live with it. Investigators who had touched the case at any point carried it with them long after retirement papers were signed, not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder of limits, of fallibility, of the thin line between persistence and oversight. The case had taught them humility. It had taught them that justice is not guaranteed by intention alone, but by vigilance, by patience, by the refusal to let time decide what matters. In Ohio, the physical world continued unchanged. Roads were still driven. Buildings still stood. Weather still erased footprints. But beneath that continuity was a shift invisible to outsiders. The past no longer pressed so hard against the present. The story had found its place in time, no longer bleeding forward, no longer demanding resolution. The person at the center of it all was no longer defined by disappearance or silence. They were remembered whole again, by name, by character, by the life they lived rather than the mystery they left behind. That reclamation mattered more than any official conclusion ever could. Justice, in the end, did not look like victory. It looked like honesty without fear. It looked like grief allowed to exist without confusion. It looked like memory anchored in fact rather than speculation. It looked like the long, difficult acceptance that some truths arrive late, but they are not diminished by their delay. The Ohio cold case did not close a wound so much as it allowed it to heal properly, slowly, imperfectly, authentically, and somewhere Beyond files and evidence rooms and archive reports, the story finally stopped asking to be solved. It simply remained as proof that even after 40 years, silence can be broken, truth can surface, and lives can be changed not by how loud the answer is, but by the fact that it finally exists,